This was no ordinary detective series. It generated an estimated $50 million for the state of Massachusetts during its 1985-1988 run. The show's gritty, genuine atmosphere came from the cost of filming on location in Boston. Despite the harsh winters and limited funds, Robert managed to make it work. He had a strong rapport with co-star Avery Brooks, who portrayed the rugged and enigmatic Hawk. The show wasn't about gunfights and automobile chases. Fans adored it because it was about justice, character, and doing the right thing even when it hurt. He then made a comeback as Spencer in 4TV, produced films, demonstrating the characters and Robert's enduring appeal. However, he did something unexpected just when everyone believed they understood him. He became National Geographic Explorer's face. He presented the program from 1988 to 1995, as it alternated between MSNBC, CNBC, and Tablespoons. His voice became the sound of wonder, elucidating ancient civilizations and mysteries of the deep sea. He meant what he was reading, not just a script. His narration of U-Boat's terror on our shores earned him an Emmy in 1992 and a Cable Ace Award in 1993. In addition, he earned another Cable AC for hosting On Assignment. These gigs weren't disposable. Robert demonstrated his range in these esteemed and solemn performances. He could have remained a legend even if he had stopped there. However, there was still another act. Robert made his Broadway debut in 2000, while he was suffering synovial cell seroma, an aggressive and uncommon cancer he had been treating since 1996. From January 5 to February 13 in Chicago, he performed as Billy Flynn. This was the big stage. Although he had already performed the role on tour in places like Detroit and Washington, D.C., he did a fantastic job at the Schubert Theater. The fact that he could really sing as well as his presentation, astounded the audiences. And there was more. He stepped out on stage with a sparkle in his eye, as his wife subsequently remarked. He illuminated the room despite the fatigue and cancer. On December 3, 1949, Heather Menzies was born in Toronto to Scottish parents who had escaped the devastation of post-World War, the Second Britain. Her father was an artist in need of a new beginning. However, they encountered adversity in Canada. They were desperate, homeless, and broke. Heather learned something from her challenging immigrant past that Hollywood couldn't impart: grit. Heather had already resided in 4 cities in 2 countries: Southern California, Miami, London, and Vancouver. By the time she was 14, the family moved and packed up every time her father's art profession faltered. Heather had to quickly learn how to establish friends, adjust to new educational systems, and pick up new accents. It was exhausting, but she was able to adjust because of all that uncertainty. She was already accustomed to changing who she was, which might be useful in the future. Then Heather entered a casting call that would alter her life at the age of 14, having no prior acting experience. The Sound of Music had hundreds of girls try out. The majority have years of training, agents, and resumes. Heather's record consisted of just 1 lost television episode. However, she possessed an additional item. She was authentic. Her inherent charisma was evident. She was cast as Louisa Von Trapp without any further explanation. Glamorous singing in the Alps wasn't the only aspect of the shoot. The movie almost devolved into tragedy because of one horrific scene. The boat overturned during the rowboat scene. Kim Carth, who played Little Gretel and was Heather's 5-year-old co-star, was unable to swim. She was hospitalized twice. The cameras were in motion. Julie Andrews made a mistake. Heather didn't freeze, but the rest of the crew did. She saved Kim's life by swimming directly to her and pulling her up. Kim became ill after ingesting so much water, and she subsequently became afraid of swimming for the rest of her life. However, what you see on screen is authentic, and the moment was retained in the film. Heather saves her co-star. The Sound of Music was a huge smash when it came out on March 2, 1965. By 1966, it had earned 5 Oscars and was the highest-grossing movie ever. It sold 283 million tickets and earned $286 million globally. In 29 countries, it was the top-grossing film. The peaceful girl from an immigrant household, Heather Menzies, suddenly became well-known worldwide. She was only 15. However, Heather didn't want to be stuck in the past like adorable Louisa. Thus, she took a radical step in 1973. In the Tender Trap spread, she posed naked for Playboy. The message was obvious, but the name was a playful homage to her Sound of Music days. She was no longer a youngster. The public was stunned. She had played the naive teenager in a family movie only 8 years prior. She was now taking charge of her image, even if it meant causing annoyance to people who still thought of her as Louisa. She starred in one of the decade's most bizarre horror movies that same year. She portrayed Christina, a crazy scientist's daughter who transforms humans into snakes. It was low budget, strange, and full of actual snakes. Heather, however, did not recoil. She was described by critics as charming and endearing. She was attempting to shine, not fade, even in such a strange job. She played Jessica 6, a character in a science fiction society where people were hunted down at 30. In Logan's Run, a significant television role in 1977. Even though the show only had 14 episodes, Heather stood out for her rebellious persona and suggestive attire. She looked too risque for a children's show. CBS executives said in a panic at one point. Pink briefs and tights had to be added to her new ensemble, but Heather refused to back down. She was now this person. She starred in PYAN, a cult horror film produced by B-movie maestro Roger Corman, in 1978, marking her most successful career move to date. Despite having a budget of just over $700,000, the movie grossed $16 million. Steven Spielberg even praised it, and Universal discreetly abandoned a lawsuit against it. The action was driven by Heather's character, Maggie McCann, a fearless skip tracer. Her performance helped make Piranha a classic, and she was able to hold her own against a group of horror regulars. In a canned hash commercial, Robert Urich and Heather Menzies pretended to be married. It sounds stupid, doesn't it? However, that scene on the set in 1974 permanently altered their lives. At the age of 25, Heather Menzies was just divorced and attempting to move on after a brief but unsuccessful marriage. At the age of 28, Robert Urich was attractive, in shape, and gaining popularity in Hollywood. They were portraying a married couple in a Basic Libby's commercial, and all of a sudden, something clicked. It was more than a performance. It seemed like a genuine relationship, so genuine that the emotion persisted even after the cameras stopped. Pretending to be in love one day swiftly evolved into something far more serious. It was more than a job. This was the beginning of a 27-year love journey. Nor was Robert some failing performer. He was on the verge of becoming famous. He became a household name when Swait aired on television screens across America in 1975. Just a year later, fans adored him for his portrayal of Officer Jim Street, the gruff guy with heart. However, it wasn't a coincidence. To suit the action hero stereotype, Robert had put a lot of effort into changing his appearance, gaining 220 pounds of solid muscle. He had the right friends, the right appearance, and the perfect charm. Burt Reynolds was especially instrumental in helping him obtain his big break. Reynolds persuaded Aaron Spelling, the producer, to try Robert. Spelling was sold after just one audition. Robert Urich was on his way in an instant. Meanwhile, Heather was experiencing a pivotal moment of her own. She had once had great fame. She portrayed Louisa Von Trapp in The Sound of Music, one of the most famous movies ever made, when she was just 15 years old. However, childhood celebrity is short-lived. She was attempting to make the difficult transition from kid star to serious actress at the time she met Robert. In addition, she was recovering from a 4-year marriage that started when she was just 20 years old, as well as Robert. Additionally, he had previously been married to Barbara Rucker, a college sweetheart. Although that marriage ended amicably, it made him wary. He married Heather a little more than a year after they first met, which is why it was so unexpected and possibly even risky. The wedding took place on November 21, 1975. Quick? Of course! However, the same thing was said by everyone who knew them. It felt natural. Only a few weeks after meeting Heather, Robert confided in his buddies that he knew she was the one. It wasn't Hollywood jargon either. It was authentic. It wasn't a passing romance, but it burned brightly. It was the kind of relationship that is rare, particularly in the entertainment industry. They turned to become an uncommon Hollywood power couple that didn't need any controversy. Heather left a legacy in movies. Robert was rising to fame on television. By 1978, he was nominated for 2 Golden Globes and secured the lead part in the sleek crime drama Vega, which aired for 3 years. It was at that point that they truly became well known, both individually and collectively. They were adored by photographers. It wasn't only that they looked wonderful together that led to magazine covers. It was the way they exchanged glances. They had no brand to sell. All they were doing was falling in love. Robert wasn't afraid to express it either. He made a conscious effort to include Heather in his universe from the start. She made appearances in 3 Vago episodes. He later secured her a role in the film Spencer for Hire. However, it went beyond simply assigning women responsibilities. He wanted to share his life. Their success was his success. Additionally, Robert fully supported Heather's decision to put her family first and slow down her acting career. In a field where ego typically prevails, such level of support was practically unheard of. Heather discovered she was expecting a child in 1975, shortly after getting married. The news made her and Robert happy, and they weren't even trying. Later on, Heather remarked, "We were over the moon." However, their enthusiasm was short-lived. The baby was lost by her. Not only was the heartbreak unbearable, but it continued. Heather had repeated miscarriages. What started out as hope swiftly transformed into a pattern of grief, and friends started to worry that the couple might not survive the emotional toll. All of this was happening at the same time, and both of their careers were taking off. 3 pregnancies, 3 losses, one after the other. Each one tore at them a little more. After the 3rd miscarriage, Robert and Heather had to make the difficult decision to adopt. Although it wasn't an easy solution, they had to go through a lengthy process and were put on a waiting list before they finally welcomed their first child, Ryan, in 1978. Behind the scenes, their world was collapsing, despite living under the spotlight of Hollywood. They wanted to give each child the full attention they deserved, so they brought in Emily in 1980 and Allison in 1998. A 20-year gap. Ryan went into medicine, specializing in infectious diseases, saying, "I went into medicine because I couldn't help my dad medically, but maybe I can help someone else." Emily went on to become a nurse and is currently employed at an emergency room in Ontario. Perhaps as a result of witnessing their father's arduous battle to survive, each of their children found their own path to recovery. Heather, who had been a rising star, Louisa in The Sound of Music, Jessica 6 and Logan's Run, made her own kind of sacrifice. She was busy, well-known, and booked. She stepped back when they adopted, though. And after 1979, she only made a few appearances, a few Vega episodes, a guest spot on T.J. Hooker, a movie called Endangered Species, and then pretty much nothing because she sacrificed everything to provide a stable home for her kids. Robert also broke the mold. When Emily had medical appointments, he had a clause in his contract that allowed him to fly cross-country. And despite being one of the busiest actors on TV, with 15 shows over a 30-year career, he made sure to be on Spencer or Hire. He wasn't the type of father who left his children to nannies while he stayed on set. When Ryan misbehaved, Robert didn't yell. Instead, he sat down on the floor with him, eye to eye, and asked him what was going on. He wanted to understand, not punish. And even in his final days, when the cancer had taken almost all of his strength, he got on the floor to play with his youngest, Allison. That was uncommon, almost unheard of in the 1980s. In August 1996, just 2 days before his death, everything changed. When Robert went in for a routine checkup, the doctors discovered that he had synovial sarcoma, a rare and aggressive cancer that affects the soft tissue around the joints and is most common in people under 30. The cancer was in his groin, and the procedure would involve several surgeries, chemotherapy, and radiation. The timing couldn't have been worse. He was in the best physical condition of his life and had just launched a new series called The Lazarus Man when the news of his diagnosis hit Hollywood hard. The show was doing well, and a second season was already planned. But Castle Rock Entertainment abruptly ended it a few weeks after the announcement. TNT had already agreed to renew the show, so the decision was shocking to everyone. In July 1996, doctors began him on chemotherapy and radiation, which dragged on for 6 brutal months. Only 20 of the 22 episodes had aired, and 2 finished episodes were left on the shelf. Before the actual punishment started, he arrived at the hospital every morning at 5:45 a.m. for a 4-hour-per-day, 9-day cycle of chemotherapy, which Robert described as feeling like pool chemicals burning through his veins after the 6th day. He was pumped full of potassium, bicarbonate, and anti-nausea medications. They used lead templates to aim tens of millions of rads, thousands of times stronger than a normal X-ray, at the cancer in his groin, trying not to destroy everything else. By February 1997, he had lost all his hair and was barely breathing. He tried to divert his attention, but there was no escaping the nausea and pain, and the illness never left him. He was fighting not just cancer, but also the cure. Then, in October 1997, a miracle occurred. When surgeons opened him up to remove what was left of the tumor, there was nothing, no tumor, no cancer, not even dead tissue. as if the illness had never existed. Incredulous, Robert said, I started to wonder if I ever had it. In 1998, he was declared cancer-free and became the national spokesperson for the American Cancer Society, telling the world, "It's part of my deal I made with God to spread the word that it is survivable." He resumed his job after doctors gave him a 5% chance of relapsing. It felt like the nightmare was finally over when he joined the cast of Love Boat, The Next Wave, and 2 years later, he fulfilled a dream by playing Billy Flynn on Broadway in Chicago. Robert and his wife Heather thought they had overcome the odds, and they began making plans for the future after doctors promised a 95% cure rate. He traveled the nation urging people to get screened early, started writing his memoir, An Extraordinary Life, and donated all $125,000 of his Who Wants to Be a Millionaire winnings to cancer research. He and Heather also established the Eurofund to support seroma studies at the University of Michigan. For once, the story seemed to have a happy ending, but it didn't. The cancer returned in November 2001, and new lumps appeared. Initially, doctors believed that a new drug could treat the disease, but they were mistaken. The disease was much more aggressive, stronger and faster than before, and the original tumor had been local. Robert was just wrapping up work on his last show, the NBC sitcom Emerald, when the disease launched its final attack. He and Heather had thought they were safe, had rebuilt their lives, and now everything was falling apart again. This one had spread everywhere, and there was no surgery, no cure, and no more hope. They knew how the story would end this time. Robert Urich, 55, passed away at Los Robles Regional Medical Center in California on April 16, 2002 at 7:22 p.m. He had been hospitalized a few days earlier due to breathing issues, and was accompanied by Heather and their 3 adopted children, Ryan, 24, Emily, 22, and Allison, just 4. He had been working on his memoirs even in his last weeks, still trying to leave something behind. His last television film, Night of the Wolf, had screened on national television the night before he passed away. Heather, who was 52 at the time of her widowhood, had been with him through every surgery, chemotherapy, and terrifying moment during their 27-year marriage. 3 days later, almost 1,000 people gathered at St. Charles Borromeo Church in North Hollywood to say goodbye, including celebrities like Tony Danza, Gavin Loud, and Tom Selleck. She had to face the world alone after losing children to miscarriage and building a family through adoption. Her grief was immense, but so was her strength. "It's sad because of who Bob is and was," Selleck said to reporters. "These kinds of people are brought out by genuine friendship." A black and white picture of Robert, encircled by flowers, was displayed outside. The man who had previously held the record for appearing in the most television shows, 15, was no longer with us. But no one was forgetting him. Heather didn't stop. They had established a fund together even before Robert's passing, but she took it a step further and established the Robert Urich Foundation because she wanted a more active approach. "It's much like every priceless day I spent with Robert," she said, adding, "It gives me energy to spearhead the foundation." She reared their kids. She continued to work. Heather Menzies Urich, who was 68 when she was diagnosed with glioblastoma multiforme, one of the most aggressive and deadly brain cancers known to medicine. In November 2017, exactly 15 years after her husband, actor Robert Urich, had died of cancer in 2002, turned her suffering into meaning. Urich had previously danced across screens as Louisa Von Trapp in The Sound of Music. Heather had fought cancer for the past 10.5 years, working through the Robert Urich Foundation, helping patients, raising money, and doing everything she could to spare other families from going through what her family had. Now it was her turn. The illness she had been fighting for had come for her. Her son, Ryan Urich, told reporters that Heather's health collapsed almost immediately after the diagnosis. "Glioblastoma doesn't wait. It spreads fast and takes faster." Robert had fought cancer for 6 years, and his battle gave them hope and time. However, Heather's decline was the opposite. The diagnosis came just 4 weeks before her death, leaving no time for preparation or lengthy goodbyes. This was particularly difficult for those who knew Heather, because she was more than just an actress. She was a ballerina, a mother, a woman who threw herself into every moment of life. In a matter of days, her voice softened, her energy faded, and she slipped away. There was no window for treatment, no last-minute clinical trials, and no opportunity to organize the kind of support she'd spent her life giving to others. She died on Christmas Eve, December 24, 2017 at precisely 7:22 p.m. at the family home in Frankfurt. Ontario, surrounded by her 3 children. Ryan later stated that she was not in pain, but after almost 4 weeks of fighting the inevitable, she had simply had enough. Her friends in Hollywood, some of whom had known her for decades, hardly had time to say goodbye. Christmas Eve is a time for family, warmth, and hope, but for them, it was the moment they lost her forever. It was a haunting echo of Robert's death, which had occurred on April 16, 2002, and Heather's death, which occurred precisely 15 years and 8 months later. The setting felt both serene and symbolic. The Sound of Music family had lost another member, Charmian Carr, who played Liesl, just over a year earlier, in September 2016. Now another Von Trapp sister was gone. The symmetry of their losses was not lost, and more suffering awaited. The little girl who had once sung farewell for so long had taken her final bow. Ryan didn't just announce her death. He detailed every detail of what happened up to that point. He claimed his mother wasn't in any agony, but after living her life with so much passion and energy, she knew when it was time to let go, and made that decision. Ryan also made sure that people remembered who she really was, not just Louisa Von Trapp, who had been a dancer, an actor, a fighter, someone who chose to spend her years serving others. And even at the end, she never lost her elegance. She passed away with dignity, not in fear or struggle.